Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we begin in Chile, where large-scale wildfires have displaced tens of thousands of people, caused widespread damage to infrastructure and housing, and prompted a state of catastrophe declaration as further fires remain likely in the short term. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we assess Russia's continued strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure during a severe cold snap, Moscow's attempts to exploit transatlantic tensions over Greenland, heavy fighting in northeast Syria that has led to major withdrawals by Kurdish-led forces, and ISIS detainee escapes, the continued enhancement of the US military posture in the Middle East amid unrest in Iran, and severe flooding across southern Africa that has killed more than 100 people and caused extensive economic damage. And in Asia-Pacific, we examine a suicide bombing in Kabul that targeted Chinese nationals, highlighting a growing regional threat trend, alongside warnings of increased insurgent violence in southern Thailand ahead of the February general election. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where central Chile is facing severe wildfires that have displaced more than 50,000 people and caused extensive damage across multiple regions. On January 18th, President Gabriel Boric declared a state of catastrophe as large-scale wildfires continued to spread. The fires have affected several regions. At least 20 people have died, almost 100 have been injured, and hundreds of homes have been destroyed. In some cases, the fires have burned directly through inhabited areas. In Neuquén, a port district in Greater Concepcion, in the Bio region, an estimated 80% of structures were destroyed. Authorities have reported several security incidents during their evacuation and firefighting efforts. On January 21st, firefighters responding to the fires in Neuquén reportedly came under gunfire, though no injuries were recorded. Authorities have also arrested at least 2 people suspected of starting fires. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The rapid spread of the wildfires was almost certainly favored by the dry, hot, and windy conditions recorded in central Chile over the past week. Between January 17th and 20th, several of the worst affected regions saw temperatures rise to around 38 degrees Celsius. Weather services now expect temperatures to ease. However, the buildup of dry vegetation over the summer months, particularly in rural areas, means the wildfires are likely to continue in the short term. The wildfires have not caused any airport disruptions as of January 22nd. However, road closures remain possible, particularly in the Bio and Nubel regions, which continue to be the worst affected. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where Russia has intensified its campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure during a prolonged cold snap, even as diplomatic engagement continues in parallel. Following the declaration of a state of emergency in Ukraine's energy sector, prompted by sustained Russian strikes on energy infrastructure as temperatures have fallen to as low as -19 degrees Celsius, authorities have announced that Kiev's schools will remain closed until February. Overnight on January 19th and 20th, Russian forces launched another large-scale wave of strikes, firing 34 missiles and 339 attack drones and decoys. The attacks primarily targeted energy infrastructure in Kyiv Oblast. Ukraine's largest private energy investor, DTEK, reported that 173,000 households in Kyiv city were left without power, with additional outages in the oblasts of Odesa, Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, Rivne, and Kharkiv. President Volodymyr Zelensky stated on January 16th that Ukraine's air defense systems had been facing a shortage of interceptor missiles until a substantial package arrived earlier that day. European allies announced several measures to assist Ukraine during the energy crisis on January 16th. These included a Finnish military aid package valued at $114 million, unspecified combat aircraft capable of interception from the Czech Republic, $26.7 million from the UK to support repairs to Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and 80 industrial boilers from Italy. Zelensky had not initially planned to attend the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, due to the water and energy crisis. However, US President Donald Trump stated that he will meet Zelensky at Davos on January 22nd. The Trump administration's posturing over Greenland and the prospect of a transatlantic rift became a prominent topic at Davos. The Secretary General of Greenland, Mark Rutte, argued that the focus should instead be on Ukraine. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump's advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, are expected to meet President Vladimir Putin in Moscow on January 22nd, following a meeting with Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev on January 20th in Davos. Now our assessment. The Kremlin has almost certainly sought to exploit the Greenland issue to deepen divisions between Europe and the US. This aligns with its longer-standing strategic objective of conditioning a transatlantic rift to support its war against Ukraine and, more broadly, its competition with European NATO members. Moscow initially issued firm rejections of any allegations that it held territorial ambitions over Greenland, claims that President Trump has used to bolster his own position on the Arctic territory. However, likely sensing an opportunity to weaken NATO unity, the Kremlin has since signaled support for Trump's ambitions. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov remarked that Trump will certainly go down in world history if the US incorporates Greenland. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov added that Greenland is not a natural part of Denmark and is a colonial conquest. He compared Greenland's importance to US security with the role that illegally occupied Crimea plays for Russia. The renewal of direct US negotiations with Putin, marked by Witkoff and Kushner's visit to Moscow, will be the first such meeting in nearly 2 months. During that period, the so-called 20-point peace plan has advanced, with Kyiv broadly agreeing to the proposal. However, its responses to the two most contentious issues, security guarantees and territorial concessions, remain highly unlikely to be acceptable to Moscow. It is, overall, unlikely that the current diplomatic efforts will produce a short-term peace. A fundamental contradiction persists between Kyiv's need for sovereignty, which necessarily depends on credible security guarantees in the face of Russian aggression, and Moscow's maximalist objectives to address what it perceives as the root causes of the conflict. The Kremlin will almost certainly continue trying to deflect US pressure by engaging in negotiations in name only, and by portraying Kyiv as the primary obstacle to peace. The situation in Ukraine remains critical, as sustained strikes against energy infrastructure have coincided with a severe cold snap. Freezing temperatures, combined with a lack of heating for several consecutive days, threaten a humanitarian crisis in cities such as Kyiv. The city's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, has previously urged residents who can temporarily relocate to places with alternative sources of power and heat to do so. However, the strikes on January 19th and 20th indicate a marked improvement in interception rates, highly likely linked to the recent delivery of interceptor munitions. 14 out of 18 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and S-300 air defense missiles were reported to have been intercepted, along with 13 out of 15 Kh-101 cruise missiles. This represents a much higher interception rate than recently recorded. By contrast, during the overnight strikes on January 12th and 13th, only 2 out of 18 Iskander-M or S-300 missiles were intercepted, along with 5 of 7 Iskander-Ks. Ukrainian air defenses almost certainly struggled to intercept ballistic missiles because, aside from the less numerous SAMP/T, the Patriot system is Ukraine's only reliable means of doing so consistently. The earlier shortage of interceptor missiles, now confirmed by Zelensky following a substantial new delivery, was almost certainly most acute in relation to Patriot PAC-3 MSE interceptors. Each PAC-3 MSE costs roughly $4 million, and a single interception can require 2 to 4 missiles, with even more needed against hypersonic targets. Ukraine has been highly reliant on US supply, now channeled through purchases by European allies, to maintain stocks of these advanced interceptors. There is a realistic possibility that the ongoing diplomatic efforts will lead the Trump administration to again use the sale of critical military aid, including interceptor missiles, as leverage to push Kyiv towards greater concessions. Staying in the region, in northeast Syria, heavy fighting has forced major withdrawals by Kurdish-led forces, raising concerns over a renewed ISIS threat following prison escapes. Clashes between transitional government forces and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces have continued, with the government offensive pushing the SDF out of nearly half the territory it previously controlled. On January 18th, the government led by President Ahmed al-Sharaa announced a ceasefire agreement with the SDF, which included the SDF's withdrawal from areas west of the Euphrates River. Government forces went on to capture Al-Tabqa and its dam, as well as Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, and took control of the Raqqa, Konoko, and Omar gas and oil fields. Notably, the areas from which the SDF has withdrawn have Arab-majority populations, and many of the local Arab tribes previously under SDF control have reportedly defected to the transitional government. For example, 4,500 fighters from the SDF's Sanadid Forces Unit, made up of members of the Shamar tribe, are reported to have defected. The announced ceasefire followed a meeting in Damascus with the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack. According to President al-Sharaa, the SDF's commander-in-chief, Mazloum Abdi, did not attend due to weather conditions. The ceasefire collapsed quickly, with clashes resuming and inmates escaping from Shaddadi prison, which had previously been managed by the SDF. Syria's Interior Ministry claims that 120 detainees escaped, with 81 recaptured, while Kurdish forces have stated that 1,500 detainees broke out. The SDF also withdrew from the Al-Hol camp on January 20th, which houses relatives of ISIS members, and fighting broke out near the Akhtan ISIS detention facility outside Raqqa. On the evening of January 20th, a new 4-day ceasefire was announced. Under the agreement, the SDF would have 4 days to conduct consultations on integrating its territory and fighters under state control, while government forces would not enter the Kurdish-majority cities of Hasakeh and Kamishli or surrounding Kurdish villages. On January 21st, U.S. Central Command announced a new mission to transfer ISIS detainees from northeastern Syria to a secure location in Iraq. CENTCOM reported that 150 detainees had already been moved, with up to 7,000 more expected to follow. Now our team's assessment. During and after the rapid Hayat Tahrir al-Sham-led lightning offensive in late 2024 that overthrew the Assad regime, months of fighting took place between the SDF and the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. The clashes ended following a US-French mediated agreement to integrate the SDF into the new Syrian military. Implementing that agreement has proved highly challenging. Key points of contention include the degree of autonomy the SDF would retain as separate divisions, and the status of Kurdish female fighters in the Women's Protection Units, the YPJ, issues within the negotiations, and likely pressure from Kurdistan Workers' Party-aligned hardliners contributed to earlier outbreaks of clashes in Aleppo. After the Aleppo clashes in October 2025, a breakthrough was reached with an agreement to integrate the SDF into 3 divisions, along with several independent battalions by the end of 2025. However, the deadline passed, and hardliners within the SDF reportedly obstructed Abdi's efforts to implement the agreement. The SDF is a coalition that requires consensus across multiple constituent elements, And this dynamic almost certainly contributed to the refusal of some units to comply with the terms of several ceasefires in Aleppo earlier in January 2026. Following the loss of almost half its former territory, the SDF is now highly vulnerable. Under the new integration proposal set out in the 4-day ceasefire, SDF members would join the Syrian military as individuals rather than as formed units. Abdi requires 4 days for consultations with other SDF-affiliated leaders, and it will almost certainly be difficult to persuade many Kurdish leaders to accept such a significant concession on integration. Even so, the scale of the losses sustained during the government offensive presents a potentially existential threat to Kurdish autonomy and security. The 4-day pause will allow SDF forces to consolidate their defences in the remaining Kurdish majority strongholds. However, the SDF has lost major leverage in negotiations following the loss of Syria's gas and oil fields. Fundamentally, al-Shara and his transitional government retain a core strategic objective: establishing centralized control over all of Syria. Al-Shara has criticized the outcomes of ethno-religious power-sharing arrangements and federal systems in countries such as Lebanon and Iraq. He almost certainly maintains a red line against implementing a federal system in Syria or granting semi-autonomy to Kurdish forces, as seen in Iraq with the Kurdistan region and the Peshmerga. This has highly likely been the SDF's key aspiration. Kurdish populations across the wider region have, at various times, faced significant abuses, discrimination, and episodes of ethnic cleansing. This history almost certainly informs the deep concerns among SDF leaders about the risks posed by losing their autonomous security capabilities. Amid the current offensive, both the SDF and government forces have already faced accusations of intercommunal violence and extrajudicial killings. Without adequately addressing these concerns in any future takeover of Kurdish areas, the transitional government is likely to risk triggering an insurgency by Kurdish militants. The SDF served as Washington's key partner in Syria during the campaign against ISIS, and it has continued to conduct regular counterinsurgency operations with U.S. support. It also maintained control over the detention facilities and camps housing ISIS members, supporters, and their families. The collapse of the SDF in these areas risks enabling a renewed ISIS resurgence, and the security of these prisons and camps is almost certainly a critical priority for the U.S. In November 2025, Syria joined the anti-ISIS coalition during al-Shara's visit to Washington. Since then, U.S. forces and the transitional government have regularly collaborated in operations against ISIS. The transitional government reportedly proposed its offensive against the SDF to the U.S. several weeks ago, and received Washington's approval on the condition that Kurdish civilians were protected. The U.S. has now almost certainly withdrawn its long-standing backing for the SDF, with barracks stating that its original purpose, as the primary anti-ISIS force on the ground, has largely expired, and that Damascus is now both willing and positioned to take over security responsibilities. However, Syrian government forces are almost certainly a less reliable partner for counterinsurgency than the SDF. This is due to the integration of jihadist fighters into Syrian security forces and rapidly expanded recruitment drives, both of which increase the risk of defections and infiltration. The December 2025 ISIS attack in Palmyra illustrates this vulnerability. A member of Syria's internal security forces killed 3 U.S. personnel. Also in the region, unrest in Iran has continued as the United States incrementally enhances its military posture across the Middle East, increasing both deterrence and miscalculation risks. Credible estimates indicate that the death toll from the protests in Iran is now confirmed at almost 5,000, including 500 members of Iran's security forces, with more than 9,000 further cases under review. However, some opposition-linked estimates place the death toll closer to 20,000. Security forces have also been conducting internal operations against separatist movements in areas such as Kurdistan and Balochistan. The regime has maintained a near-total internet blackout, severely limiting independent verification and situational awareness. This signals its intent to prioritize internal control despite the economic and reputational costs. Though Iran has pledged to restore internet access by January 23rd. The regime has not yet executed any protesters, but officials continue to threaten harsh punishments and have begun expropriating assets from individuals involved in or supporting the protest movement. President Trump has prevaricated publicly, initially praising the regime for suspending executions before later calling directly for regime change in response to accusations that the U.S. is fomenting unrest. He has also signaled that help is on its way. The U.S. force posture in the region remains significantly lower than during the 12-day war in June 2025, but it is being gradually strengthened. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group transited the Malacca Strait on January 20th and is expected to arrive in theater around January 24th, significantly expanding U.S. strike and deterrence capabilities in the region. The U.S. Air Force has also forward-deployed 12 F-15 fighter aircraft, supported by 4 KC-135 Stratotanker aerial refueling aircraft, to Jordan from the UK. Washington is additionally deploying further terminal high-altitude area defense and Patriot air defense systems to strengthen layered air defense coverage across the region. Israel's defense establishment has raised its alert level ahead of any possible U.S. strikes on Iran, anticipating that retaliatory attacks would likely target Israeli territory. Officials have not ruled out the possibility that the Israel Air Force could strike targets in Iran in response to missile fire. On January 19th, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned that Israel would respond with unprecedented force if Iran were to attack. Iran's foreign minister has warned that Tehran would retaliate without restraint against any military attack, stating that, unlike in June 2025, Iran would respond with everything we have. Many of Iran's shorter-range missiles, which cannot reach Israel but can strike U.S. bases in the Gulf, were not used during the previous round of hostilities. Kataib Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed Shia militia in Iraq, has also warned that it will attack U.S. bases in the region if the U.S. strikes Iran. Meanwhile, the Gulf states have continued to urge Washington to prioritize negotiation and restraint over military action. A senior member of Qatar's ruling family, Khalid bin Jassim Al Thani, has reportedly cautioned the U.S. that its presence at Al Udeid Air Base is conditional, framing U.S. forces as tenants rather than permanent stakeholders. Now, our intelligence assessment. The Trump administration is likely seeking to maintain strategic ambiguity by balancing its military reinforcement with inconsistent public messaging. Trump's shifting rhetoric is consistent with his established pattern of using ambiguity to exert pressure while preserving freedom of action without committing to immediate large-scale military operations. The pause in the strikes has also created more space for potential diplomatic breakthroughs, or for the protests to subside, reducing the immediacy of any U.S. intervention. However, these developments are unlikely to remove the underlying drivers of tension. New triggers, such as executions or renewed repression, could rapidly lead to escalation. While the impending arrival of a U.S. carrier strike group, combined with an uplift in aerial capabilities and air defenses, will almost certainly increase U.S. strike capacity and deterrence in the region, it still remains significantly below the posture seen during the June 2025 12-day war. At that time, the U.S. maintained 2 carrier strike groups in CENTCOM's area of responsibility and 1 in EUCOM's, alongside a substantial forward deployment of fighter aircraft and other naval assets. The deployment of 12 F-15 to Jordan, supported by tanker aircraft, does provide the U.S. with enhanced operational flexibility. It enables sustained combat air patrols, strengthens air and missile defense, particularly in support of Israel, and allows for rapid limited strike options if required. However, this posture lacks the mass exhibited in 2025 and may also relate to counter-ISIS operations, given that the US formally withdrew all military assets from Iraq, apart from a small number of advisors, in mid-January. The further deployment of additional carrier strike groups, along with a substantial surge in land-based combat aircraft, including the forward positioning of bomber task forces, would signal a clear shift from deterrence and contingency planning towards a US decision to initiate potentially large-scale, sustained military operations against Iran. However, unlike in 2025, there is no clear military objective analogous to Iran's nuclear program. At present, there are no firm indications of what such an objective might be, with rumors ranging from degrading Iran's internal security apparatus to broader ambitions of regime change. This lack of clarity significantly complicates escalation management and heightens the risk of miscalculation, especially given the absence of any formal communication channel between Washington and Tehran. That risk is likely further elevated as Iran conducts nationwide air defense exercises and raises readiness levels across its forces. Should the US commit to direct military action against an Iranian regime already under acute internal pressure and increasing isolation, there is a high likelihood of a strong, multi-domain Iranian retaliation involving regional proxy forces. Iran's most probable course of action would be to reassert deterrence and regime credibility through a combination of direct missile and UAV strikes on US bases. Tehran likely judges that the risk of a large-scale US ground intervention is low, and that such attacks would increase pressure on Washington from its Gulf allies while potentially undermining the long-term US military presence in the region. Attacks on Israel are also likely. However, if these are calibrated to demonstrate capability rather than overwhelm Israeli air defenses, there is a realistic possibility of a limited Israeli response, as seen in Israel's restrained and largely symbolic retaliation to Iran's missile and UAV attack in April 2024. We then move to southern Africa, where severe flooding across Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa has killed over 100 people and is likely to drive long-term humanitarian and economic impacts. Continuous heavy rainfall has triggered widespread flooding across the three countries. In Zimbabwe, more than 70 people have been killed, 51 injured, and over 1,000 homes destroyed since the beginning of January. Floodwaters in southern Zimbabwe, combined with ongoing rainfall, are feeding rivers that flow into Mozambique, worsening conditions downstream. In Mozambique, at least 103 people have died, and more than 200,000 have been affected by flooding nationwide. Over 513,000 people have been impacted across the provinces of Gaza, Inhambane, Maputo, and Sofala, with the cities of Xai-Xai, Chokwe, Boane, and Maputo all experiencing severe disruption. More than 50,000 people have been evacuated. The government issued a red alert on January 16th after the death toll surpassed 100 since the start of the rainy season. According to the Minister of Transport and Logistics, around 40% of Gaza province has been submerged. 152 kilometers of road have been destroyed, and over 3,000 kilometers damaged. The World Food Programme reports that approximately 173,000 acres of farmland are now waterlogged. In South Africa, the provinces of Limpopo and Mpumalanga have been the worst affected, particularly around the towns of Phalaborwa and Graskop. At least 30 people have died, and more than 1,600 homes and 31 schools have been damaged. Kruger National Park, one of Africa's largest wildlife reserves, was closed after several private reserves near the park were cut off by floodwaters, prompting the evacuation of more than 600 visitors. South African authorities declared the floods a national disaster on January 19th, and the South African National Defence Force deployed 2 helicopters to support rescue operations and evacuations. Flooding has also been reported in Tanzania, Madagascar, Malawi, and Zambia. According to the U.S. Famine Early Warning System, northern Botswana is also likely to experience flooding. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The heavy rainfall has been driven by a slow-moving low-pressure system linked to La Niña. La Niña is a climate pattern characterized by cooler-than-average sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean. During La Niña events, southern and eastern Africa typically experience above-average rainfall, more frequent and intense multi-day rain events, and a higher overall risk of flooding. The flooding is highly likely to result in severe economic damage. Some estimates indicate that the Mozambican government faces costs of 6.6 billion meticais, around £77 million, to provide humanitarian assistance, support displaced people, and supply health services and food to accommodation centres. The government is highly likely to remain largely dependent on aid from neighbouring countries. The flooded farmland will almost certainly deepen the long-term economic damage. The most affected crops include maize, rice, beans, cassava, and sweet potatoes, all key staples for household consumption and local markets. Livestock and fisheries have also been hit hard. Zimbabwe and South Africa have seen similar impacts, with damages in Limpopo province alone estimated at around £180 million. The flooding is highly likely to exacerbate poverty across the region and increase the need for international aid. The flooding has almost certainly increased the risk of waterborne, vector-borne, and sanitation-related diseases. Contaminated water sources and damaged sanitation infrastructure will highly likely accelerate the spread of cholera, particularly in Zimbabwe, which has faced recurring outbreaks in recent years. E. coli, Shigella, and other pathogens are also likely to spread, driving up cases of diarrheal disease. Standing water from the floods creates ideal breeding conditions for mosquitoes, making a rise in malaria cases likely in the coming weeks. Heavy rainfall is still ongoing across the region and is likely to further worsen the humanitarian situation. With the ground now fully saturated, even relatively small amounts of additional rainfall are likely to trigger new instances of flooding in the coming weeks. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, a suicide bombing in Kabul has underscored the growing threat to Chinese nationals from regional jihadist groups. On January 19th, a militant affiliated with Islamic State Khorasan province detonated an improvised explosive device at a Chinese-run hotel restaurant in the Shah-e-Nah neighborhood of Kabul. One Chinese national and 6 Afghans were killed, and several others were injured. ISKP has claimed responsibility for the attack. The blast took place in an area of Kabul generally regarded as safe, with a high concentration of businesses and hotels serving foreign visitors. It was almost certainly intended to target and kill Chinese citizens. Now our assessment. Since the Taliban returned to power in 2021, China has significantly expanded its commercial and political ties with Afghanistan, while also deepening its investments in Pakistan. As Beijing's economic footprint has grown across the region, several transnational and local militant groups have increasingly prioritized attacks on Chinese nationals and assets. These threats come not only from religiously motivated extremist groups such as ISKP, but also from nationalist and separatist movements, including the Balochistan Liberation Army. Over the past decade, Chinese nationals have increasingly been designated as desirable targets by Islamist jihadist groups, including the Islamic State. This trend is partly driven by long-standing ideological opposition to the Communist Party of China and by Beijing's ongoing policies of detaining Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang and suppressing religious expression, points that ISKP channels cited as justification for the Kabul attack. However, the rise in propaganda targeting Chinese citizens and assets also likely reflects Beijing's increasingly visible presence overseas. The sharp rise in attacks targeting Chinese citizens internationally has almost certainly prompted Beijing to adopt additional risk mitigation measures. In early January, for example, Chinese officials agreed with their Pakistani counterparts to establish dedicated special protection units tasked with safeguarding Chinese assets. Following the Kabul attack, China's foreign ministry reportedly formally requested that the Taliban government take further steps to protect Chinese nationals. And finally, in the region, Thailand's largest insurgent group has warned of increased violence in the Deep South ahead of the 8th of February general election. Sources within the Barisan Revolusi Nasional, Thailand's largest and most active insurgent group, have indicated that while the BRN does not reject the upcoming elections, it is likely to carry out attacks, including arson, shootings, and bombings, to remind political parties of its demands for self-government in the predominantly Muslim regions of the Deep South. The warning follows a series of coordinated explosions at 11 petrol stations across the provinces of Pattani, Yala, and Narathiwat on January 11th, which injured 4 people and caused extensive property damage. Although the BRN has not officially claimed the attacks, they have been widely linked to the group and are consistent with its previous tactics. In response, the Thai military has increased security across the region, closed all border crossings with Malaysia, except the main permanent trade checkpoints, and tightened immigration procedures. Now, our intelligence assessment. The previous attacks and the recent warning were likely intended to signal to Thailand's main political parties that the insurgency and local issues must not be overlooked during the upcoming electoral cycle. Insurgents in the Deep South have historically increased the scale and frequency of attacks during election periods to raise visibility, exert pressure on political actors, and draw national policy attention to the region. However, this electoral cycle is expected to be dominated by debates over anti-corruption and institutional reform, economic concerns, and the ongoing border conflict with Cambodia. These issues have likely pushed separatist concerns further down the national agenda, increasing the incentive for insurgent groups to conduct high-visibility, disruptive attacks. Insurgent attacks during electoral cycles have traditionally remained confined to the Deep South, and there is no clear precedent of violence spreading to other parts of Thailand during elections. The Thai military has also increased security deployments to disrupt attacks in the region and is likely to limit the risk of any spillover. However, the discovery in July 2025 of 11 improvised explosive devices at prominent tourist locations, including Phuket Phang Nga and Krabi, was strongly linked to the BRN. The number 11, whether reflected in the number of devices, the number of attacks, or used as a date, has often appeared in BRN operations, potentially as an attribution marker. This plot, together with past operations, such as the 2016 bombings that targeted tourist areas, including Hua Hin and Surat Thani, shows that although uncommon, insurgent groups retain both the capability and the intent to carry out attacks beyond their traditional area of operations. As a result, attacks outside the Deep South cannot be fully discounted in the run-up to the February 8th election. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.